Alright, today we're jumping into economics. So you're going to absolutely love graphs. And the most fundamental place to start off with economics is supply and demand, where supply is supply, and demand's it's the demand. Alright, I gotta explain this without saying supply and demand. Supply is how much of a particular good exists within a market, and demand is the quantity that participants in the market want of that good. Now to visualize this, we're going to use an XY chart, where the Y-axis is price and the X-axis is quantity. And anyone who has gone for an economics degree knows these things become much. There's a lot of this. There's a lot of this thing. So we're going to talk about one good in one market. So say that you are able to produce a particular good. You're looking at the market. If you are able to sell that good for more, then you'll be more likely to want to sell that good. If you aren't able to get as much money selling it, well then it won't be quite as worthwhile to you to go into the market, produce more of it, and sell it. So we can see where price is low, that line has a lower value on the quantity axis, because less price you can get from it, fewer people are going to want to go and try to sell it. But it slopes upward, whereas price increases, more people become interested and want to sell that product. So we get this upward sloping line. The line of supply slopes up as something can be sold for more people want to sell it. And as more people want to sell it, more of it enters the market. So from the supply side of things, as price increases, the quantity of it increases. But there's another side of that. If you're looking to buy something, if something costs quite a lot, you're less likely to want to buy it. Where if something is relatively inexpensive, you might be more likely to go and purchase it. So now this new line we've added, this downward sloping purple line, is the demand line, where the higher the price is of something, you can see on the quantity line, there are fewer buyers trying to buy it. Where when you go lower on that price line, you have more people who want to buy it. So as price increases, fewer consumers will demand it, and as price decreases, the demand for the good will generally increase. So this gives us two different sloping lines that slope in opposite directions. The supply line, which slopes upward, and the demand line, which slopes downward. But if there's so much supply, and there's not enough demand, then it won't all get sold. And if there isn't enough for that demand, then more people will rush in to try to sell it. And eventually, these two lines meet. The supply line and the demand line meet. Now at this point, we can see it lines up with a point on the X and the Y axis. There's a price and a quantity. So right here, where supply and demand meet, they're in a state of equilibrium, and we can find that price and quantity. But let's say something changes, and now the supply line shifts. Let's say all of a sudden there's a new technology that allows a lot more to be produced, or a whole bunch get dumped into the market, and now that supply line is shifted to the right. And now if you go to the same price as in the past, there's a higher quantity that exists there. So let's look at the demand line again. When that supply line shifted as more supply entered the market, what happened from the point of view of where supply meets demand, assuming demand stayed just where it was? Well now, the point where they intersect on the quantity line is higher up. So more people are buying it. And the point on the price line is lower, and people are buying it for less. So as that supply increases, pushing price down, more of it's being sold at a lower price without any change needing to happen in the demand for the good. Now let's say that supply line stays where it is. What if demand suddenly increased? All of a sudden there's some new trend and it's part of a current fashion, or there's some very pressing need people have for it. Well, as that supply line has stayed still and the demand line has moved up, More is now being demanded at a given price. A price where, say, only half of people would have wanted to buy something, now you're getting a larger chunk of people who are willing to buy at that price. And that equilibrium point shifts with it. Now, I didn't use numbers, but you could apply numbers and graph an actual supply and demand function. So looking at where they intersect the x and y axis, after those two shifts, that first point where supply met demand and that second point where supply met demand, it looks like price didn't move overall in the end, but the quantity being sold in the market increased. And you can plug in numbers and try moving them around in all sorts of different ways and see what happens. Where they meet in the new spot, what's the new price, what's the new quantity, what happened to the overall market. And we're seeing as a general rule, as demand increases, price increases, and as supply increases, price decreases. But what are those slopes? The slopes are elasticity. And elasticity describes that for the change in price, what is the change in demand? If price were to increase and demand were to drop very quickly, then that would be a very elastic demand. But if price were to increase and it didn't change much, then that would be inelastic demand. So let's look at this demand line. At this first price, where that demand line meets price 1 along the x-axis, if you were to graph that down to the quantity, it's a pretty low quantity demanded. But this second price, that's lower, has a higher quantity, and the third, a lower price, has a higher quantity demanded than the second. With this slope, this elasticity, we're seeing pretty big jumps in the quantity demanded as price decreases. But let's draw a steeper slope and see at those same prices on the y-axis, where does it match up on the x-axis? This is much more inelastic. The difference between the first to second and second to third prices don't move along the x quantity axis nearly as much. So this steeper line here is a more inelastic demand curve, where a change in price isn't really changing the demand nearly as much compared to that first demand line. It is more inelastic. One of the biggest things that can impact someone's demand for goods is their income, and different goods act differently in this regard. A normal good acts how you'd normally expect. As income increases, there's a higher demand for that good. And this is generally how most goods are. Just think of a good where, as you make more money, you'd be more likely to buy some. This would be things like clothes, items for hobbies, maybe certain snacks or foods that you like. But there are some goods people find themselves demanding more as their income decreases. These are termed inferior goods. Inferior goods have their demand increase as income decreases. These tend to be lower priced goods. For this, think about a good that you might be more likely to buy if you found out that you just got your last paycheck for a while and really needed to make it last. What sorts of things, normal goods, might you give up, and what sorts of things, inferior goods, might you be more likely to start buying instead? These might be things like lower cost foods. Luxury goods are goods that, like normal goods, demand increases as income increases, but they start taking up a higher fraction of that income spent as income increases. This is a sort of good that people generally are not too likely to buy, but if their income increased significantly, they'd now be much more likely to buy, and it would make up a larger chunk of their spending. These are things like luxury cars, luxury clothes, and art. I don't know about you, but I really need to get a grip on my foie gras budget. Then we have Veblen goods, which are an interesting phenomenon. They're goods where an increase in price increases demand. People are more likely to want to buy it because it costs more. This could be something like designer clothes. Someone who specifically sets out to buy something because it is an expensive item and therefore more desirable its own barrier to purchase is what makes it wanted in the first place? I think we can easily sum this up with one word: status. See this? This is a $20,000 watch. I have it because I'm very good with money. So we've talked about goods once they hit a market. But what about the process that leads to them entering the market? There's a whole area of economics to that too. And it's one that's very important in finance. Marginal productivity is how much more output is created by adding one more unit of labor. Or a way to think about it is, how much more can a company produce of something by hiring one more worker? So let's make another one of these always around charts. Remember what I said about getting an economics degree? It's this. It's this thing again. It's just more of this thing. So on the x-axis, let's graph the quantity of labor. Good way we could think about it is the x-axis is the number of employees hired by a company, and the y-axis is how much of a good that it can create per employee. So let's connect this arc. On this first point here, on the labor line, is pretty low labor and about midway through the output. So for this low level of labor, this is how much output we are able to get by adding that employee. But let's go further along the labor line. Let's hire some more guys. Well, now our output is looking better relative to labor. It's more productivity. So things have improved by adding that additional labor. But now as we go further, that output relative to labor seems to be dropping. And that's because after a certain point, adding more labor won't increase productivity. You'll be hiring more labor, incurring more labor costs, but you won't be getting that same output relative to the amount of workers as you did earlier on. So each step along the way, if we were to divide that up into each step is adding one more worker, one more unit of labor, then that change in where we land on the output line is marginal productivity, where it increases for a while, but after a while, adding more labor, those next new employees aren't getting more output per worker as they were earlier on. So we can go back and look. Where along that line did you have the highest output? And it looks like around here. So we could say at this point, you are getting the highest marginal productivity for adding more labor, but if you were to go beyond it, your marginal productivity for adding the next worker would decrease. Now, marginal profit is how much profit are you getting each time you increase your production by one. Each time you create one more of a good, how much profit is that adding? So let's graph cost on a y-axis and output on an x-axis. First, we're going to show marginal revenue, which is downward sloping, because for each additional unit you create of a good, you're getting a smaller amount of revenue by adding more. If you go from 0 to 1, that's quite different than when you have your 1/millionth going to your 1,000,001st of a good, because there's just a lot more of it in the market. For each additional output, how much more revenue does that generate? And here we have marginal cost. For each additional product produced, what is the cost incurred in order to produce that? For each plus one good, how much additional cost do we incur? And it has this odd curve shape because early on, as you ramp up production, you're able to become more efficient at producing it, incurring lower costs. But like labor as a cost, at a certain point, if you keep adding more and more, you're just incurring more costs. You stop driving costs down and start introducing new costs instead, because you've gone past that point where it's efficient. Now, if we go to one of those marginal points and subtract marginal cost from marginal revenue, we get marginal profit, revenue minus cost. When we have marginal cost lower than marginal revenue, we have a positive marginal profit. But when marginal cost is higher than marginal revenue, we have a negative marginal profit. And you can see along this chart, there's this point where they intersect, and it flips from going from positive marginal profit to negative marginal profit. And right at that midpoint is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So at that point, there's no reason to produce any more goods because the additional profit we are adding for creating one more unit is negative. Marginally, once you get past that point, you are not profitable anymore. So the firm will continue to produce output until that point where marginal revenue equals marginal profit. If it goes beyond, marginal profit's down. Everything before that, you can keep producing and keep getting marginal profit, but once they meet, that's the end. There's no reason to go further. Now, a firm will have a different degree of control over different costs. Fixed costs are costs that don't change no matter how much of it is used, and variable costs change depending on quantity. A fixed cost could be the building itself. Doesn't matter if you use one room or all of them, it is what it is. While a variable cost could be electricity, since some month you might use less than others and spend less on it. So we talked about buyers and sellers, and we talked about a bit about what's going on in the firm, so as a general overview. But what's the overall environment where the two meet? There are different competitive environments that buyers and sellers might find themselves in. Perfect competition is a market where there are a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers that exist with homogeneous products, so no one has anything that uniquely stands out, and no actor has unique market power. No one can uniquely set or demand prices, and all producers are on an even footing, all with an equal degree of competition with each other. Imperfect competition is similar, but just a bit less competitive. There are fewer competitors, products might be more differentiated, and some of the actors in that market might be able to influence the market. So it isn't perfectly competitive, but generally the market could be described as being overall a competitive landscape. Monopoly, there's one guy and he has all the control over the market. There is one producer who makes a certain good and can set how much there is and how much it costs. A duopoly has the same parameters, but is when there are exactly two producers in a market. An oligopoly is a bit more competitive technically, but it is generally used to describe a market where there isn't any true competition. There's a very small number of producers who make up the market. A cartel could exist in something that previously was a genuinely competitive market, but is when a group of producers form a group together to agree to take certain economic actions in order to influence that market. That could be a group of producers all colluding together to produce less than they normally would in order to artificially increase the price of their product. Now, the last topic I'm going to cover in this introduction video is the concept of economies and diseconomies of scale. An economy of scale is when marginal costs decrease as the business gets larger. We were looking at marginal costs earlier. Well, if you were to grow your business, would those marginal costs decrease? And if so, it's an economy of scale. A diseconomy of scale is the opposite, where as the business gets larger, those marginal costs start to increase. Back to the old one of these things. In this graph, we're going to graph price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. This blue curve here is the marginal cost. So we can see on the left side of the line, it starts with a higher price at a low quantity, but begins to slope downward. And then once it reaches a certain point that I have here with this red line, it starts to increase in slope, where quantity increases, but price increases. Where it is sloping down and price is decreasing as quantity increases, this is an economy of scale. And once it crosses that line and begins to slope upward, we see price is increasing along with quantity. It's now entered a diseconomy of scale. It's beneficial to be in an economy of scale, and a firm will grow in an economy of scale if capable, and will incur lower costs as a benefit. However, if a firm enters a diseconomy of scale, then that benefit evaporates, and now costs begin increasing as a detriment to increasing in size. So that's what I've got for this one. I'm going to continue to cover economics, as economics is an extremely valuable topic in finance. So do subscribe and follow along if you're interested, because I'm going to be going to some pretty complex topics pretty far into this by the end. But until the next one, have a Have a groovy day.